biggest crisis that we now face as a race, as a world, as civilization, is global warming, climate chaos. The biggest challenge that we have is how we use energy. How can we need energy, how can we extract it, how can we deploy it in ways that don't compromise the aspirations for our children, for future generations, for the poor and rich all over the world and for other nations. Global stability, national security, all of these things that are at jeopardy because of the way that we use energy. Well, today, we don't need to abolish carbon to understand that our deadly addiction to it is the principal drag on American capitalism. We are borrowing $1 billion a day in this country, mainly from nations that don't share our values, in order to import $1 billion of oil, largely from nations that don't share our values. And this export of $750 billion in American wealth, $750 billion annually, has beggared a nation that, when I was a little boy, owned half the wealth on the face of the planet. We give every year $1.3 trillion in subsidies to the oil industry. Things like the oil depletion allowance and the direct tax breaks and subsidies of building pipelines and all of these federal money. And then the indirect subsidies, like the $100 billion we spend every year protecting, without the Gulf War, protecting the oil pipelines in the Gulf, and escorting ships across the Atlantic, et cetera, et cetera. We give to the nuke industry about $500 billion in subsidies every year. It's catastrophically expensive. I always say to people, they say, well, what about nuke? Isn't that the solution? I say, I'm all for nuke if we can make it cheap, if we can make it economic, and if we can make it safe. And right now it's neither. It's still the most catastrophically expensive method ever devised for boiling a pot of water. It caused it's an industry that, first of all, has succeeded, like all of these industries, in externalizing its principal cost, including the cost, most obviously, of disposing of its fuel, which, we, federal taxpayer, now have to take care of for the next 30,000 years, which is 5 times the length of recorded human history. And if you internalize that, there's no way that it could be economic. Even with all the subsidies, the building, construction, all these other subsidies. I mean, their lack of insurance is another vast subsidy. If somebody ever says to you, well, the nuclear industry is safe, it's been made safe now, right? Just ask them this question: if they're safe, how come they can't get insurance? And then coal, coal, of course, is probably, in the end, I say almost $1 trillion, but they're probably even more highly subsidized. The New York Times had an article last week which reported on a federal study that shows of 300 rivers and streams randomly chosen all over the country, where they took fish out and tested them, and every fish in America, every single fish, freshwater fish in our country, now has dangerous levels of mercury in it. The University of Texas just did a study that shows that schools that are in the plume of coal-burning power plants have much higher special education needs and costs than schools that are not, all across this country. Today, according to CDC, there are 640,000 children born in this country every year who've been exposed to dangerous levels of mercury in their mother's wombs. Well, this is one of the costs of burning coal that you don't have to pay when you're paying 7 cents a kilowatt hour. We have, you go to EPA's website tonight, and it shows you that there are 60,000 Americans who die every year from ozone and particulates discharged by coal-burning power plants in this country. 1 million asthma attacks, 1 million lost workdays. Those are part of the cost of coal. The Appalachian Mountains, the forest cover on the Appalachian Mountains have been destroyed now from acid rain from Georgia all the way to northern Quebec. That's one of the costs that's not included in that 7 cents a kilowatt. 2 hours from where I live in the Adirondacks, the oldest protected wilderness in North America, in the world. It's been protected as forever wild since 1885. 1 out of every 5 lakes is sterilized from acid rain. That's one of the costs of coal. They have privatized publicly owned resources. the waters of the Adirondacks, the forests of the Appalachians, the air in my children's lungs. They privatized the commons, the publicly owned resource, in order to create an asset for themselves, and so that they can dominate, unfairly dominate a marketplace. They get subsidies by stealing these things that belong to the rest of us. I want to tell you about the good news. And these subsidies, these hidden subsidies and direct subsidies that we give to the incumbents, form the principal barrier for new forms, more efficient, more abundant, more clean, safe, and wholesome forms of energy from entering the marketplace. We know this, that every nation that decarbonizes society experiences instantaneous prosperity. Iceland in 1970 was the poorest country in Europe. It was 100% dependent on imported coal and oil. And the government of Iceland, mainly because it was concerned with global warming, which impacts the northern latitudes disproportionately, decided to decarbonize Iceland. And again, there were objectors, said we have to move slowly, but they moved deliberately and quickly, and within 15 years, they'd made Iceland 100% energy independent, with 90% of their energy coming from geothermal. And Iceland, during that period, went from the poorest country in Europe to the fourth richest country by GDP on Earth. Brazil, 20 years ago, decided to decarbonize its transportation system, and today, as a result of that, Brazil, while the whole world economy collapses, is enjoying the longest, most robust economic expansion in the history of Latin America. You can go on and on with those examples. There are many, many, many more. But we have in our country far greater geothermal resources than they have in Iceland. We're number 2 in the world in geothermal. We're the top 3 in solar, according to Scientific American. Enough solar power in a land in 19% of the most barren desert land, the desert Southwest, an area 75 miles by 75 miles, to power 100% of the energy needs for our country, even if every American owned an electric car, to decarbonize America. We have the Midwest is the Saudi Arabia of wind. We have North Dakota is the windiest place on Earth at sea level. There's enough wind power, harnessable wind, in North Dakota, Montana, and Texas to provide 100% of the energy needs in our country. The energy need of our country, energy demand in our country is 1,000 gigawatts a day. That's what we use. Half of it is carbon. That's what we need to replace. We could replace it easily with that combination of wind and solar. The problem, and we have an administration now that is intent on doing that. The obstacles are these: number 1, the huge subsidies to the incumbents. Number 2, problem is that we have an atomized system in this country. We have 50 different PUCs, Public Utilities Commissions, each one of the states, each with its own arcane and Byzantine set of rules that restrict access to the grid, so there's no national marketplace. What we need to do is create a national marketplace that attaches the grid to every American home and allows people to sell energy back to the grid. Right now, you can't do that. T. Boone Pickens, who I spent a lot of time with in the last month, wants to build wind farms all over Texas and North Dakota and Montana, et cetera. But he can't, on average, it takes him 2 years to get the permit to hook in, even when the grid is available. We need to create a national marketplace that does what a market is supposed to do, which is to reward good behavior, which is efficiency, and to punish bad behavior, which is inefficiency and waste. Right now, we have a marketplace that is governed by these perverse rules. The reward, the filthiest, dirtiest, most destructive, most poisonous fuels from hell, rather than the cheap, clean, green, safe, wholesome fuels from heaven. And we need to change that around and create a market that allows every American to hook in and sell energy, and the lowest cost provider wins, and every American becomes an energy entrepreneur, every home becomes a power plant, and we power this country on entrepreneurship, initiative, energy and imagination, human energy and imagination, and what Franklin Roosevelt called American industrial genius, rather than Saudi oil.